Here's a guy who thinks it takes faith to be an atheist.
Today I stand before you to make a shocking confession. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Now, don't get me wrong, I tried. I bought the hoodie, I followed the Reddit threads, and I even said there is no God in a Richard Dawkins accent just to see how it felt. But atheism? It's a belief system so full of blind leaps, wishful thinking, and unprovable assumptions. I realised, ironically, it takes more faith to believe in nothing than a creator.
Is that what it means to be an atheist? It means you believe in nothing? I must not be an atheist if that's the case, because I believe that lots of different things exist.
Part 1. Atheism is a belief system. Atheists say they don't believe in anything, they just lack belief.
No, they don't. I've never heard an atheist say that they don't believe in anything. Maybe what you mean is that being an atheist doesn't commit a person to any particular belief. That depends on which definition of atheist you mean. In the philosophical journals, the word atheist is typically used to mean a person who believes that no God exists. In common parlance, however, lots of folks use it to refer to someone who simply does not believe in a God. Agnostics are a kind of atheist by this definition.
Sounds humble, right? But let's unpack that. To be an atheist, you have to believe that everything came from nothing.
Not true. I don't believe that there ever was nothing. To claim that atheists believe that everything came from nothing would be like if I were to claim that theists believe that God came from nothing. Rather, just as you believe that God didn't need to come from anywhere, I don't believe that the universe needed to come from anywhere.
Life came from non-life.
Life is essentially self-replicating nucleotide chains. Why would it be such a stretch to believe that self-replicating nucleotide chains came from independent nucleotide molecules? And if life only comes from life, and life came from God, I guess that would mean that God is a life form? If that's the case, then what is life exactly? What does God have in common with a ficus that makes them both living things?
Consciousness came from chemistry.
Consciousness is all activities. It's thinking, feeling, perceiving, etc. What is carrying out these activities if it's not the biochemical structures of the brain?
Morality came from matter.
From where else would these things come? I'm sure you believe they came from some immaterial God, but why is that a more legitimate or probable source than matter? What objective, non-circular reason is there to obey God's morality?
And reason came from randomness.
Who says that reason came from randomness? Reason is part of how our brains work. They don't operate randomly.
That's not a lack of belief, that's a worldview.
None of these beliefs are entailed by atheism. Most atheists are physicalists, but you don't have to be a physicalist to be an atheist. You can believe that consciousness, life, morality, and everything else is magical woo. And as long as you don't believe in a God, you're still an atheist.
Richard Dawkins admits in The God Delusion that the universe has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And I'm like, whoa, that sounds more like the terms and conditions of Facebook. Part 2, the cosmological clues. Now let's talk about the origin of the universe. The Kalam cosmological argument. Number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause.
William Lane Craig, the apologist who uses this argument the most, says that the reason we should believe this is the case is because we never see things just popping into existence without something creating them. Of course, we also never see anything get created out of nothing, which is supposedly what God did, but apologists would like us all to ignore that. Also, when we're talking about the beginning of time itself, it's not really analogous. A thing popping into existence implies a time when it did not exist, followed by a time when it does exist. Even if we never see this happen without a cause, that's not analogous to the beginning of the universe, because there was never a time when all of space and time did not exist.
2. The universe began to exist.
We don't know for sure that the universe began to exist. It could have pre-existed the Big Bang.
3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This argument has been endorsed by Christian philosophers like William Lane Craig, and even atheist philosophers like Anthony Kenny, who admits a proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe the universe came from nothing and by nothing.
I believe in the Big Bang, and because I actually understand it, I know that it doesn't follow that the universe came from nothing. Either the universe predated the Big Bang, or time itself began at the Big Bang, and there never was nothing. If there was a time when there was nothing, and then the universe started existing subsequent to that time, then I could understand asking what caused that change. However, it doesn't make any sense to say that there was ever a time when there was nothing, because at all points in time, at the very least, time would exist. So even if time hasn't existed infinitely, it's not as though there was a state of nothingness before time began, because before time doesn't make any sense. Since that's the case, time has, in a sense, always existed. There was never a time when time didn't exist.
Have you ever tried making something from nothing? If you have, you might be a magician or a Marvel writer.
But isn't that what theists believe? Theists who believe in creation ex nihilo believe that it is, in fact, possible to create something from nothing.
Part 3. Fine-tuning. Next, let's marvel at the fine-tuning of the universe. Physicist Paul Davies said the impression of design is overwhelming. Stephen Hawking noted that if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part of a 10th to the power of 16, the universe would have collapsed and expanded too fast for life. That's not coincidence, that's a lottery on steroids, blindfolded backwards and underwater.
It's only true that life is impossible with a different expansion rate if there is no God. If there is an all-powerful God, then this God would have the power to make life possible in a universe with any expansion rate. In fact, if we lived in a universe with a set of parameters that made the natural development of life impossible, that would be far greater evidence that life is not a merely natural phenomenon. Also, the mere fact that we can imagine the parameters of the universe being different doesn't mean that they ever actually could have been.
The multiverse, please. That's not science, that's sci-fi.
Unlike God, which is totally scientific.
That's like saying you didn't find gold in your backyard, but there are infinite other universes where you did. It's not evidence, it's escapism. Part 4. Biological evidence. And then there's life. Darwinian evolution explains minor changes, but can it explain DNA coding, cellular machinery, irreducible complexity?
Yes, it can. DNA coding is merely the fact that nucleotides correspond to amino acids and ribosomes use the DNA sequence to sequence the amino acids into proteins. There's nothing about that which implies intelligence. Creationists hear the word coding and they think that means that DNA must be a means of communication from an intelligence. This isn't the case. Cellular machinery is a consequence of chemical machinery. Molecules work mechanically, so why would it be so far-fetched to think that they would form structures that also work mechanically? What looks like irreducible complexity was explained by Darwin in The Origin of Species. While certain physiological and biochemical processes have consequences that would not result if they were slightly different, and that makes it look as though they couldn't evolve by gradual changes, the idea that this makes the evolution of these processes impossible relies on the assumption that they had the same function throughout the course of their evolution. They often do not. Lungs used to be swim bladders. The mechanics of the bacterial flagellum used to move proteins through the cell membrane. This is called exaptation, and the idea of irreducible complexity doesn't take it into account at all.
Complexity. Biochemist Michael Behe, it's a cool name, points out that systems like the bacterial flagellum require all parts to function or none work at all. That's not chance, that's engineering.
Nope, it's exaptation. If you take one part away from the flagellum, it no longer works as a flagellum, but there are other things it can do that provide the cell with a survival advantage.
Sir Fred Hoyle calculated the odds of spontaneous life as forming as 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000.
It's a good thing life is a consequence of the mechanics of chemistry and is not a spontaneous occurrence.
That's like saying a tornado hit a junkyard and built a Boeing 747 during a pandemic in a lockdown with a mask on. Part 5. Morality. Now let's talk about something we all care about, right and wrong. Atheists say, you don't need God to be good. True, but that's not the issue. The issue is, without God, how do you define good?
I call things good when they agree with my conscience. That would be the case even if there is a God. If there were a God who dictated what is good and what is bad to us, and if what he said didn't agree with my conscience, then I simply wouldn't recognize his standard of morality as moral.
If we're just stardust bumping into other stardust, who decides right and wrong? Molecules, neurons, Twitter? Even atheist J.L. Mackie admitted moral objectivity doesn't fit well in a godless universe.
It doesn't fit well in a universe with a God either. First of all, God is a subject, not an object, so even a morality that comes from a God would not be objective. But even if God were an object, there would still be no non-circular reason why we ought to regard God as our moral standard. My conscience is my moral standard, not because there's any objective reason that justifies doing so, but rather because I am simply incapable of doing anything that is intolerable to my conscience.
If Fred is just evolutionary unhelpful and not objectively wrong, Houston, we have a moral crisis.
Why? The existence or inexistence of any objective moral standard is not going to make any difference whatsoever with respect to my ability to tolerate it, so why should I care whether it's objectively immoral or not? Even if there's a God who endorses it, and there are passages in the Bible that seem to imply that he does, it's still not going to be tolerable to my conscience. It seems to be the case, however, that if you were to convince theists who make this argument that God says it's morally obligatory, then they would do it. If you were to convince me that there's a God and that this God says it's morally obligatory, I would still not do it. The fact that you could get these folks to do pretty much anything just by convincing them that there's a God who commands it is far more frightening to me than the idea that morality has no objective basis.
Part 6. Historical evidence for Jesus. Let's talk Jesus. He's not Thor, he's not Zeus, and no, Christianity did not steal from Horus, despite your stoned mate at uni, what he said.
The story of Jesus is all original bullshit, no stolen bullshit.
Historically, Jesus is rock solid. Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger all mention him.
They mention what Christians and others said about him. Not one of these historians was an eyewitness to anything Jesus did. Stop mentioning these guys as though they're giving independent accounts. They're not. They're repeating Christian claims and claims about Christians, not corroborating them.
The Gospels were written within 30 to 60 years of the events.
Certainly no embellishments could be contrived in only 30 to 60 years.
The disciples were willing to die for what they saw.
This is like a speed run of the most frequently debunked arguments. There are no records that say that the disciples were martyred specifically for a belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus was crucified for defying the Roman occupation of Judea. If his followers were martyred, the most probable reason was that they were followers of a guy who led a rebellion. Why would the Romans even care if they believed that Jesus rose from the dead or not?
Atheist scholar Gerd Ludemann said, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as risen Christ. Now, if you want to say they hallucinated, you've got to explain why."
Bereavement visions are a thing, but I don't think that's the most probable explanation. None of the disciples who witnessed the crucifixion wrote about it. We have to take the word of the gospel authors, who were anonymous, that the disciples saw Jesus rise from the grave. I suspect the most likely explanation is that the gospel authors were either lying or they were lied to.
500 people hallucinated at the same time.
Apologists love to cite Paul's assertion that 500 people saw Jesus, but one account of what 500 people saw does not carry the same evidentiary weight as 500 independent accounts. The story about the 500 witnesses is one account that was written by one guy, Paul, who doesn't even claim to have been there. He said someone else told him that this happened. Paul could have been lying, or he could have been lied to. These are far more probable explanations than a guy actually coming back from the dead.
Explain why there's an empty tomb.
I think the simplest explanation is that the body was taken. Even the idea that Jesus survived the crucifixion, while far-fetched, is far more probable than a resurrection.
And explain why the enemies of Jesus became followers.
Well, Paul says that he became a follower because he heard a voice claiming to be the voice of Jesus. Wouldn't it be far more probable that this was an illusion or hallucination than it being the voice of a dead guy that he heard?
Again, sounds like something happened and it wasn't just group therapy gone wild. Number 7, part 7, personal experience. Now, personal experience. I've prayed and seen answers, I've seen people healed, lives changed, chains broken. Atheists, that's anecdotal, that's not evidence. Me, actually there is, on YouTube and in peer-reviewed studies. Check out Craig Keener's Miracles, the credibility of the New Testament accounts. He documents over 1,000 medically verified cases. Keener is no quack. He's a professor with 4 doctorates and more footnotes than Dawkins has Twitter rants.
Simply listing cases of people getting better after praying, if that's what you're talking about, isn't evidence of anything. You need to compare people who pray or who were prayed for to a control group to demonstrate its efficacy. Look at people who get lots of prayers for them to get better and compare them to people who didn't get any prayers or as many prayers and compare the two groups. Francis Galton did such a study. He compared the life expectancy of the royal family, who get lots of prayers nationwide for their well-being, to the life expectancy of non-famous people of comparable wealth, and he found no difference. If prayer works, why would that be the case?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.